week 14 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few quarterbacks I look to get on the wire this week. The first guy, Taysom Hill of the New Orleans Saints. He had a good fantasy day, but not really a real-life day in his start versus the Dallas Cowboys in week 13. 264 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 4 interceptions though. But he did have 11 rush attempts for 101 yards, and that's where the bonus comes in for Taysom Hill. We know he likes to run. He's not really that much of a quarterback, but Sean Payton and this offense believes in him, obviously, as a gadget guy and a guy who could do many things for this offense. So right here, good fantasy day versus the Cowboys, even though in real life it wasn't good. I know he hurt the finger in that one where he had a splint, and it definitely didn't help his throwing. But right here, week 14, a good matchup at the New York Jets for Taysom Hill. We just saw Gardner Minshew chew him up in week 13, and I think Hill could have a decent game at the Jets. This same team, it's most likely over for them making the playoffs after losing 5 in a row now. And with a good matchup and with a guy who's going to give you a lot of yards rushing the football, he's available right now and is Hill in 66% of fantasy leagues, and he's definitely worth an ad as long as he's healthy this week. The next quarterback I look to get is Teddy Bridgewater of the Denver Broncos. So Bridgewater here, he hasn't been that great this season, but it's going on a matchup-based type of thing here for Teddy. Week 14 versus the Detroit Lions. And the Lions, we know, can't stop really anyone. They give up a lot of passing yards, and it's a good matchup here for Bridgewater. So Bridgewater, I think, could have a good ball game. Versus Detroit. It's a good matchup. He's available widely in tons of fantasy leagues at 77%. And the last few weeks here for Bridgewater, week 10 versus Philly, 226 pass yards. Week 12 versus the Chargers, 129 pass yards, a touchdown, and 10 yards rushing with a touchdown. So right here, I think he'll play better versus Detroit. They're going to have to throw the football maybe early in the game. The only thing I'll give Detroit here is they play every game hard. I know they're 1-10-1 on the season, but a lot of ball games for the Detroit Lions have come down to the wire. So I could see this one with Denver being tight a little bit here. And Teddy Bridgewater trying to find the end zone. And Teddy Bridgewater throwing the football a decent amount of times. And he's just got to get Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton going. Those two guys have been struggling for the last few weeks. And I think this week here versus Detroit in week 14, if they could get going, Bridgewater obviously will have good numbers. The next quarterback's Jimmy Garoppolo of the San Francisco 49ers. So Jimmy G, he's been a mediocre fantasy quarterback for the most part this season. But he's a guy that easily could get you 18 to 20 fantasy points each week. So the last few weeks here for Jimmy G, week 11 at Jacksonville, 176 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 6 rushing yards. Week 12 versus Minnesota, 230 pass yards, a touchdown and an intro. And week 13 at Seattle for him, a pretty up and down ball game, 299 passing, 2 touchdowns, 2 intros. So right here, Jimmy G in this offense, they look pretty in sync. Even though I know it was a tough loss in week 13 at Seattle, but he still had a good game. And week 14, a middle of the pack matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals, I know, give up the 7th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks, but we've seen quarterbacks have good games, and we've seen the Bengals in a lot of shootouts, and we just saw one obviously in week 13 versus the Chargers where Herbert put up a big number. So right here, I think Jimmy G could be a serviceable quarterback in Cincinnati in week 14, and right now he's available as well in 78% of fantasy leagues. The next quarterback's Cam Newton of the Carolina Panthers. I know I said drop Cam Newton last week, but right here, it's a matchup-based thing for me here to pick up Cam Newton and put in your lineup if you really need him. So right here, good matchup, week 14 versus the Falcons. That can't stop anybody. They give up the second most points to quarterbacks on the season in fantasy football. So the first 3 weeks since Newton's been back with the Panthers, in spot duty at the goal line, week 10 at Arizona, 8 pass yards, a touchdown, 14 rushing yards, a touchdown. Week 11 versus the Washington football team, 189 pass yards, 2 TDs, 46 yards rushing and a touch. And then week 12 in Miami, a horrible performance where he got benched in the second half of that game. Newton, 92 pass yards, 2 windows, 5 rushing yards, and a touchdown. He had the bye week, and coming off the bye, I think he's going to get more familiar with Matt Rule's offense and try to get going and come back in week 14 versus Atlanta, who can't stop anyone. And it's a good bounce-back game here for Newton, in my opinion. And he's available in 71% of fantasy leagues. And the 5th and final quarterback I look to get on the wire this week's Taylor Heinicke of the Washington football team. So Heinicke's available in 61% of fantasy leagues. And we've seen some good games from Heinicke on and off throughout the season. So the last few games for him: Week 11 at Carolina, 206 pass yards, 3 touchdowns, 30 yards rushing. Week 12 versus Seattle, 223 passing, a touchdown and an into. And then Week 13 in a grinded out victory at the Vegas Raiders, 196 pass yards, 2 touchdowns and an into, and 10 rushing yards. So Week 14, a great division matchup. It's going to be between the Dallas Cowboys and Washington, their first meeting of the season. And I think Taylor Heinicke could have a pretty good game in this one versus the Cowboys. I know the Cowboys, they've made some quarterbacks turn the ball over this season, but in my opinion, they still are vulnerable to the big play. Scary Terry McLaurin's a good weapon, and Antonio Gibson out of the backfield here, and some speedy guys like Carter as well and Sims. So Heinicke versus the Cowboys, I think could have a decent ball game. And right now, like I mentioned, available in 61% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few quarterbacks I look to get on the waiver wire heading into Week 14 of the fantasy football season.